Welcome to How to Beat Nick, Episode 7, where we focus on executive compensation. This is most relevant for cases like clawbacks, but it's a subject that Nick is actually very conversant in and something he's very likely to develop new cases around. The way executive compensation works is pretty simple, right? Most executives get a small amount of cash, usually a couple $100,000, which keeps the bills on, the lights on, the bills paid, food on the table, basic standard of living shit. The rest of executive compensation usually comes in one of two forms. If they've done a great job for the past year, they'll get a bonus that sometimes is cash. Regardless of the job that they do, they will usually get a compensation package of equity. And very often, actually, senior executives get equity the second they start a job, not a year or two into it. That equity is very often actually restricted. So you can't sell it immediately. You have to hold on to it for a year, 3 years, 5 years before you can sell it. And the goal with this compensation package is pretty simple. Basically, it's, hey, you're an executive. You're going to make decisions that shape this company. I want your incentives to be 100% aligned with the company's incentives. So rather than have like a political negotiation every year where you're like, I want my salary to go up for more money. I want more money, yada, yada. No. We've given you equity. If you do a good job, if the share price of this company goes up, you will make a lot of money. If you do a bad job and the share price of the company does not go up, you will not make a lot of money. It's just the simplest way to align executive incentives without having that like internal politics issue arise every compensation cycle. So companies have a lot of ways to enforce that internal alignment. Very often executives are mandated to hold a specific amount of equity. Most of their compensation is in the form of equity, and they're obligated to disclose when they're selling their equity. Just again, so that the company can ensure that their incentives are properly aligned. Consider how this applies to clawbacks. Clawbacks is basically, hey, if a company is caught in wrongdoing, we can take back your equity, take back your bonus, take back your compensation, because you did a bad job and you deserve to be punished. A couple of things of note on clawbacks. Firstly, if an executive is found guilty in a court of law, people are going to take their money back regardless. A finding of guilt of corporate malfeasance in an American court means that an executive has done something so egregious, or very often fraudulent, and has broken the shield of corporate liability. If you break the shield of corporate liability, you expose yourself to personal liability. If it's criminal liability, you go to jail. I think classic example of this is Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff didn't run a Ponzi scheme. Bernie Madoff had a company that ran a Ponzi scheme. But Bernie Madoff was so intrinsically tied to the fraud that he broke the shield of corporate liability and so went to jail. Notably, no banker in 2008, one idiot from Credit Suisse or whatever, but very few people in 2008 committed such egregious and outright fraud that they broke the shield of corporate liability, and so none of them went to jail. If you go to jail, you will immediately be facing civil suits from the government, from your investors, from anyone you ever took money from. And they will take every penny you've got, basically, in those civil suits. So Nick's case, the clawbacks case, doesn't operate in instances where somebody is found guilty of fraud. Or if it does, it's squaw. It really only operates in instances where the company is found guilty of fraud, but the individual executive officer was not so closely linked to the fraud that it broke the shield of corporate liability. A couple things to note about the way that functions. One, whoever gets to make the determination on whether or not compensation is clawed back is like an incredibly political decision. Because very often, right, just like think about it from your perspective of your debate e-board. And imagine all of you were getting paid and your compensation was directly correlated to the Cody points that your school got next year. If one of your schools was accused of rigging Loyola, you're obviously you as an executive officer are going to lose a lot of money because you're going to lose a lot of OD points. But you could blame Helen. You could blame Laura. You could blame Sam. Just Nas, you could blame, Cam or Shiloh or David Bloom or whoever. And then you could be like, well, I'm going to lose some money, but at least the company gets to take money away from these other people. And more importantly, actually, to many people, you get to divert blame. You get to be like, don't take my money. I wasn't responsible. That guy was responsible. Take his money. And so the central thesis of Case, which is that we will punish the correct wrongdoers, depends almost entirely on the people administering justice and the rules surrounding who is actually to blame and the determination of who is to blame. Nick, I'm certain, in MG goes, the courts will decide that. But bear in mind, if the courts decide that an individual has committed fraud, they are already personally liable. So we have to figure out what the alternative mechanism is, because it cannot be the criminal court. And honestly, I'm not even sure it can be the civil court. Executive compensation isn't particularly complicated, right? It just comes down to that question of incentive alignment. But it is something that is heavily negotiated because of the millions of dollars at play at almost every single company. Contracts are functionally airtight, and they have been iterated over the hundreds of chief executive officers that have gone through these companies. So the details of compensation matter a ton. And if you want to have a debate about executive compensation, you need to be willing to establish those details in POCs before you shape your op and win the round.